evening, friends. I want to come back to you today, and I just kind of want to follow up on my video I did last week. Last week I talked about the video. I talked about what I saw with George Floyd and my opinion on the officer's actions. And I also touched a little bit on what I thought the cause of death may be. As we know today, Dr. Bodden, who's a world-renowned pathologist hired by the Floyd family to conduct an independent autopsy, released his findings. And his findings are that George Floyd died from mechanical asphyxiation. And as I opined before in my other video, not just that the officer has his knee in Mr. Floyd's neck, the other two officers are on his back and he's in the prone position. And like I said before, that is one of the most dangerous positions you can ever be in during an encounter with police. And now you have to add to the fact that these two other officers, so let's take the first officer out of the equation for just a second, and let's talk about the two officers that are literally on top of his back pushing down. When you breathe, your lungs expand outward. When you're in the prone position and there's force being applied to your back, it's difficult, if not impossible, for your lungs to inflate. And that is what Dr. Bodden's opinion is, irrespective of pre-existing medical conditions, irrespective of drugs or alcohol. Now, the original medical examiner from Minnesota released his findings, and he mentioned no evidence of traumatic asphyxiation. And what that means is, typically with traumatic asphyxiation, there is a blunt force injury, an impact injury. Sometimes you see these in car accidents where the front of the vehicle is pushed in, the steering wheel compresses or strikes someone in the chest and they're stuck in that position. And even with their injuries, they can't breathe. In this particular case, there doesn't have to be any injuries present. In traumatic asphyxiation, and the original medical examiner mentioned the neck, typically in a strangulation, and I think that word was used in his opinion, you'll see injury or trauma in the strap muscles on the side of the neck, or there's a little bone in the middle that could be fractured, and that's evidence, or petechial hemorrhaging, where all the whites of your eyes, the blood vessels burst, and they're red from the blood vessels bursting. He didn't find any of that, but what I do predict is, he did say this is his initial findings. I think once he gets the toxicology back and all that, he still is going to rule this death by asphyxiation. That's my prediction. If he doesn't, then that man needs to resign, period. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. We know that Dr. Bodden confirmed what my suspicions have been all along. So we'll see what the medical examiner, the original medical examiner, comes up with when his complete investigation is over with. I want to talk a little bit about the charges. There have been some questions about whether or not this officer was charged appropriately, the officer who has his knee in Mr. Floyd's neck. So in Minnesota, third-degree murder is, we don't have degrees here in the state of Georgia, but in third-degree murder in that state, you don't have to prove intent, meaning they don't have to prove that this officer's intent was, when he encountered George Floyd, that he had malice in his heart and he wanted him to die. There's a thing called overcharging, and you can ask your attorney friends about this, criminal defense attorneys or prosecutors that you may know. If you overcharge somebody and they go to trial, it's difficult sometimes for a jury to come to the conclusion that that charge, that they meet the elements and that they find them guilty. It's especially hard, historically, to convict police officers in cases like this. So I think what the prosecutor, and I know now the case has been handed over to the Attorney General of Minnesota, I think their strategy at this point was that we charge what we can now that we think we can get a conviction on. I'll still be interested to see what the Attorney General of Minnesota does. He could re-indict this case and add a higher murder charge. But anytime you do that, especially with a police officer, the burden of proof with a jury historically, and in my opinion is not whether that's right or wrong. I'm just telling you how it is. What I've seen, and historically, those cases are very difficult to get a conviction. Again, my opinion has not changed from the beginning. I've done this job a long time, investigating homicides, but you don't have to be a homicide detective to see and come to the conclusion of what we saw in this video. A 12-year-old kid who's played video games their entire life and know nothing about current world events could look at that video and know that that's absolutely improper and is wrong. So that officer absolutely should have been charged. And now let's go to the other two officers. The two officers that had their knees and their hands pushing down on Mr. Floyd's back. They absolutely should be charged. They're complicit. You can go online and you can actually read the criminal complaint that was used for probable cause to arrest the first officer. In that criminal complaint, it mentions one or both of the officers mentioning, should we turn him over on his side? So that right there tells you that they have an understanding that this situation is dangerous for Mr. Floyd. They verbalized that. They said, should we turn him on his side? Another officer suggested or brought up the possibility that maybe Mr. Floyd's suffering from what's called excited delirium. And that's typically if someone is ingested drugs or they're acting in a manner that, it's not normal for a person to act, and they're sweating a lot and they're hot and they exhibit a tremendous amount of strength. Those are indicators of excited delirium. Whether he had that or not, that officer recognized something was different with Mr. Floyd, and he verbalized that. And from the criminal complaint, and I urge you to go online and look it up yourself, the officer who has his knee in his neck after those officers said, should we turn him on his side? Could he be suffering from excited delirium? He chose to say, we're not moving him. He's good right where he's at. So with that said, for me, with my experience, there's absolutely no question about what should happen. Let's talk about the Asian officer, and I'm going to end this video with him. The Asian officer who is basically providing security, trying to keep his fellow officers safe, that's what they're trained to do. I have no problem with that. That's what they're supposed to do when you're doing something that's legal. That officer, as he turns around, and the bystanders and a medical professional, and if she truly is a firefighter, in the video you can see her identify herself as a paramedic or a firefighter, says he can't breathe, check his pulse. Other people are asking the same thing. That officer has an obligation, a duty to make sure that Mr. Floyd is safe. And I'm going to end it with this. And I'll say this to anyone who asks about training. Everybody says training. We need more training. I think the training that we need for police officers is to teach officers that even if you are not the one that's physically touching or dealing with the suspect or a person under arrest, if you're there, you have an obligation to make sure that he or she is safe. Whether you are effecting an arrest, a hold, handcuffing in a prone position, you are just as responsible as the other officers. And I think that's the training that we need to see. We need to see that training in police academies from the beginning, where officers are, instructed, and they learn that you could be criminally responsible for that. It's his responsibility. What happens with officers, they have this contagious behavior. If the officer says it's okay, then it must be okay. If what they're doing, and he's an experienced officer, seems to be okay, it must be okay because he said it's okay. That's not going to fly anymore. Right now, what we need to do is each officer needs to be responsible for themselves. And if they see an officer doing something that's improper or unsafe for a suspect, it's their obligation, it's their duty, not just departmental policy, but under the law, to make sure that that person remains safe. And I say, not just his fellow officers, but the people being arrested.
Hey y'all, as you can see from the video, this gentleman is basically breaking down the laws and giving his basic opinion on what's going on, and the procedure of everything. And I just think that it's very interesting to get the perspective from a person that's actually worked as a homicide detective. You can definitely go check him out. He is a retired homicide detective, narrator of TV One's hit show True Crimes, hit show ATL Homicide, and he has very in-depth knowledge on the procedure of how things are supposed to go. I advise everyone to go check out his page, IG.